Hello, welcome to the Power of 10 Forum Series. I'm Scott Black, Chairman for the Board of Directors of Cumberland Region Tomorrow, a 10-county regional collaborative. We're excited to engage with you through these discussions on some important issues facing our region. We are so thankful to the great panelists who give their time and expertise to these discussions. We're also very grateful to the support of our sponsors. Without their support and the support of all of our donors, we cannot bring this series to you. We hope you engage in this discussion and work with us as we strive to make the growth of our community the best for all of us.
Hello, welcome everyone to the Power of 10 series hosted by Cumberland Region Tomorrow. My name is Cindy Popplewell. I'm a water resources engineer with Wood, Environment, and Infrastructure. I'm also the vice chair of the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Management. I'll be your facilitator for today's event. Our topic is flood resilience. And as many of you know and have experienced, we've had multiple devastating floods across Tennessee over the past few years. So our forum today, we're going to discuss how we can assist our communities to become better resilient to future flood events. We've got a great panel for you today with floodplain administrators, educators, technical professionals, and community leaders. But before we begin, I want to give a shout out to Stantec for sponsoring today's event. We wouldn't be here without you, so thanks so very much. And I also want to say thank you to all of Cumberland Region Tomorrow's supporters. So to get us started, let me introduce our panel to you. We have Zach Bartscherer. He's with Pew Charitable Trust Flood Prepared Communities Program. We have Tom Brashear. He's the Director of Development Services for Wilson County. Tom is also the Middle Tennessee representative of our Tennessee Association of Floodplain Management. We have Janey Camp. She is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Vanderbilt University. We have Patrick Dobbs, a senior water resources engineer at Stantec. And we have Roger Lindsay. He is a program manager with Metro Water Services here in Nashville, Tennessee. And Roger is also the chair of our Tennessee Association of Floodplain Management. And so I'm going to kick it off today with you, Roger. I know you've been on the front lines after multiple flood events here in Nashville. Do you want to talk first about some needs that you see that your community and communities across Tennessee have to be more resilient and better prepared for flood events?
Certainly, I'd be glad to do that. You know, we look a lot at guidance we get from FEMA. FEMA and their administration of the National Flood Insurance Program often refers to their program as a three-legged stool. And the components of those three legs include things like flood mapping, and increased accuracy, increased availability of flood mapping for a lot of communities, floodplain management, the regulations that we now see more and more as communities adopt more current international building codes, that these floodplain requirements are now incorporated deeply into the international building codes. Flood insurance, availability of insurance for property owners. There are 400 communities in the state of Tennessee that are members in good standing of the National Flood Insurance Program. And as long as your community or your county is in good standing, everybody in your community is accessible to flood insurance. If your insurance agent's telling you that you don't qualify for flood insurance because you're not in the floodplain, you need to get a new flood insurance agent. So, and then there's a fourth leg that's now being discussed more and more, and it's a big part of what we're doing in the Metro Nashville area, and that goes to mitigation. What are we doing in our community that allows us to be better prepared for flood events, to protect our citizens? In a lot of cases, mitigation may involve, home buyout programs, where we buy homes that are subject to repeated flooding, and that way we're able to offer fair market value to homeowners, and we protect them from the potential to experience future devastating floods in their homes. So those are kind of some of the components. We'll talk as we go along today about things like higher standards. Do we need to enforce or implement standards to a higher level? In Metro, we have a 4-foot freeboard requirement that requires new homes to be built well above that 100-year flood elevation. So those are some of the components that we would look at.
Can you add on to that with some of your floodplain standards in Wilson County?
With some of my, I didn't hear the last part of your question.
Just some of your flood standards or your standards of construction in Wilson County that address flooding?
Yes, actually, we have adopted the state's model floodplain ordinance and have had that model ordinance as our primary go-to for floodplain management for some time. It's worth noting that FEMA's guiding federal legislation simply calls for homes to be built at or above the freeboard, which is the base flood elevation as determined by FEMA maps or what have you. The state model ordinance actually requires at a minimum that in a studied area that finished floor elevations be at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation as determined by FEMA data and maps. And that's what most of the communities, as I understand it, outside of someone like Metro or another community who may have heightened their standards to the 4-foot standard that Roger was talking about, most communities actually at least abide by that 2 foot above freeboard elevation criterion. And in an unstudied A zone area, if there's a subdivision, for instance, there may be a requirement for a flood study to be undertaken before we allow that property to develop, and then we will again apply that 2 foot freeboard requirement. However, if it's a one-off lot out in a rural area, they do have the ability to build as long as they build 3 foot above surrounding grades. If they do that, everything under their finished floor is considered below the base flood elevation, and they have to implement other requirements of the FEMA flood ordinance, which include things like hydrostatic venting.
Tom, you had just mentioned in good standing. Can you explain what that means in relation to the National Flood Insurance Program?
In good standing to the FEMA flood program, every 5 years, the FEMA Region 4, which is the region that we are within, actually comes into your community and does a community assistance visit, which is just a long word for audit. They audit your program. They're not auditing it for financial reasons. They're auditing it to make sure that your community is trying to uphold the federal CFR requirements at a minimum. Again, the state model ordinance assists us in that because it respectfully is a little bit heightened above the CFR or federal regulation requirements. So to be in good standing, you've got to go through those community assistance visits with a representative from FEMA Region 4, and usually with a representative from the state of Tennessee, who is a liaison. Her name is Amy Miller, that works for the state of Tennessee and just tries to make sure that ensure that all of the communities that are part of the National Flood Insurance Program are compliant at a minimum with the Federal Register or the CFR requirements.
Thanks, Tom. So you mentioned, working within that mapped floodplain. Janey, could you talk a little bit about flooding, outside of that mapped floodplain area?
Absolutely. Thanks, Cindy. So, we focus a lot on NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, and the FEMA mapped floodplain areas and flood zones. But we're also seeing a lot of flooding happening in low-lying areas. You could have just a low-lying area with a street in an urban area where the culverts are just not able to convey the water away from that low-lying area. We're seeing a lot of flooding in people's backyards, front yards, and other places that we haven't seen a lot of flooding before. And so I think that kind of circles back to Roger's comment about having flood insurance to be prepared. You could absolutely experience flooding, and our communities are experiencing flooding across Tennessee in areas that are not adjacent to streams, rivers, and tributaries. And so we need to think about kind of some of the urban flooding issues and also issues with flooding not adjacent to water bodies across the region and state, where you could sustain damages and have impacts that need to be mitigated through various means. that are not tied to those flood maps.
Janey,
Cindy, just to touch on that, it's when you consider the intensity and duration of these storm events, to look at it from an engineering perspective, we're seeing much longer duration storm events with higher intensity rainfalls. The storm that we referred to as the Waverly event last fall, the rain actually didn't fall on Waverly as much as it did upstream. And then it was the combined flow from all of that very severe, 16 to 18 inch rain events that caused such devastating flooding in Waverly. But that storm had a sequence of time where for 3 consecutive hours it rained 3 inches in each of those 3 hours, totaled out to 9 inches of rain in 3 hours. That's a staggering amount of rain, and it's way more rain than what the modeling of our streams. When we consider how the flood insurance rate maps are developed, when you consider that level of rain that we're seeing more and more often, you're vulnerable outside of a floodplain, and you should consider you should consider the need to be protected and to even to use higher standards for your construction of your home.
Following up with what Janey was talking about areas outside of the floodplain, in the May 2010 event, which many of us in Middle Tennessee are very familiar with, that flood, I believe, depending on what authority you go to, was at least a 500-year percentage-wise event, if not more than that. Some even heard some refer to it as a 1,000-year statistical event. But in that storm, just as an example, in Wilson County, over 50% of our significant flooding occurred outside of regulatory floodplains, as determined by FEMA and by the local governments here in Wilson County, whether it be Mount Juliet and Lebanon, who have their own floodplain administrators, or out in the county, or the city of Watertown, which my office oversees from floodplain administration perspective. Along the lines of what Roger was talking about, we had a recent meeting with the Corps of Engineers to talk about some watersheds where we had data that's fairly dated, that we would like to get updated data to then direct our updates to our FEMA floodplain, regulatory floodplains. We got into a discussion about how we are seeing more intense events more frequently. And to that point, it's actually changing potentially some of the storm curves that we use historically. My understanding when I first got here in 2001 was what was commonly referred to as the 100-year event, which is not really once every 100 years. It's, I think, a 1% chance of occurring on any given day at any given time over a certain period of time. And for a 24-hour storm in Wilson County, that was somewhere around 6¼ inches when I first got here in 2001. Now, as I understand it, due to different intensity rain events that have occurred since that time, including the 2010 flood, those curves have actually been statistically altered to where statistically it may be more in keeping to say that a 100-year storm here is now over 7 inches or closer to 8 inches. So, I mean, that's worth noting, is that we as an industry of stormwater managers and engineers and others who are involved in drainage and stormwater probably need to be looking at where we're getting our data from and whether or not some of those data sources do need to experience an update.
Absolutely. And to kind of, iron that out a little bit more, we're using a lot of historic data. Those curves, they're called intensity, duration, frequency curves. There's a NOAA Atlas 14 chart that is used by many engineers for design of culverts and other infrastructure. And a lot of that is based on like 30 years of historic data that, is out of date. There's efforts underway to start updating some of that. And then I would argue that we need to go beyond that, especially as we see funding coming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, to communities to think about building better, building, beyond the typical standards, as Roger has mentioned, beyond, our typical standards, for culverts and things, and maybe increase if we can to account for future more intense storm events that we're likely to see as we see changes and the trends that we've started seeing recently. We can't replace all the infrastructure, but as we are investing in new infrastructure, we can, push the envelope a bit and do better to prepare for the future. And that 100-year event is a 1% probability of exceedance in a 1-year period based on historic data. But Tom mentioned the flood of record, which does adjust some of those considerations. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Tom.
It's important, I think, also to understand, if you're not engaged in or don't work in this industry on a regular basis, though, that 100-year standard, 1% storm standard is a design standard. It is not a flood protection standard. If you're built to the 100-year flood elevation, if you're built to conform to that map, in the 2010 flood in Nashville and west of here, in Bellevue, the western edge of Nashville, the water levels in the Harpeth River were 8 feet above that 100-year level, and there were 3,000 homes flooded severely, some over the peak of the roof. These are homes not in that 100-year floodplain because there was such an extreme event that occurred. So it's not a flood protection standard. And anything you can do to implement higher standards, higher regulatory standards in your community protects your residents to a higher level than what that design standard defines. So it's something that needs to be considered. Higher standards will provide for higher levels of protection, and both protection of life and property. So consider that.
Patrick, if I could bring you in to talk a little bit about the methodology for that FEMA DFIRM mapping, the FIRM maps, as well as outside of the floodplain. Can you talk a little bit about that methodology or the H&H hydrology and hydraulics behind that?
Yeah,
Sure.
so kind of Janey and others have kind of alluded to, the methods possibly being a little bit out of date. And there are efforts ongoing at the federal government. So from Tom's comment about these rainfall intensities and rainfall depths, NOAA is currently seeking input into how to revise that data moving forward. So they're going to update those numbers that are 10 to 20 years old with all the rainfall data that we've collected in that time period, add that to the old period of record, and it's going to develop new storm data for us to use. Tennessee is also, as you can see, we have a lot of passionate folks on the call here, and they are, what's happening in Tennessee is we're seeing this passion just slowly push the state forward. Tennessee is kind of just historically been a little bit too content with where we are as far as flood mitigation goes. And that's changing, as we've seen. And so right now, part of the issues that are being identified, it's not really a methodology issue. It is that in Tennessee, most of the mapped floodplains are based on models that are on average 20 years old. And then when you look at states adjacent to Tennessee, well, their modeling is on average 10 years old. That's a big difference in technology, because within that, usually we're targeting a 10-year update. And so as we start moving toward, maybe analyzing, restudying a lot of these things, that's when we're going to start looking at these areas more outside of the floodplain. And FEMA actually within their program has provided the option to analyze what's called the 100-year plus event. And I know that, Roger's talked about this extensively in presentations in the past, where we look at, okay, well, let's analyze today's conditions, and then let's make an estimate based on, our development plan for 20 or 30 years out. And let's analyze those conditions and look at that on a map, and then talk about, okay, well, we know the minimum regulation says we're going to regulate to the 100-year event. Does our community need to regulate to a potential future condition in order to have cost savings and reduced risk in the future? And then all of this kind of comes back to, you start talking to mayors and elected officials, and they're like, okay, well, where does the money come from? So this is one thing that we need to understand, is that when we look at it, we're trying to save lives and property. Well, if the state invests just a little bit, then like many programs that the state runs, there's lots of federal dollars available that come in. So you make a 10% investment, the federal government makes 90% of the investment. All of a sudden you get a program up and running that's providing resilient services across the state, helping people to get grants for flood mitigation. Right now the Tennessee Economic and Community Development Department is working on a portal where they're going to provide planning level flood risk assessments for the state, where you're going to be able to go in, you're going to click on your community, click on an area, and all of a sudden what's going to pop up for that area is an estimated 80%, 90% level confidence of what the flooding would look like today. And so these, the state's moving this direction. We just need to keep this passion going and keep moving forward.
Yeah, and I'd say that in addition to Tennessee moving forward, there's a lot of states across the country that are currently and successfully thinking about how we can implement resilience practices in both our design and the projects, and really ways that we can make communities more resilient. I know through the federal ARPA funding, it looks like Tennessee is looking to appropriate over $1 billion into new stormwater funds. And those funds, the first tranche and applications started in April, and those are for collaborative projects. These are regional projects that look at stormwater, wastewater, and drinking water services. Starting, I think actually yesterday, there's non-collaborative projects that are becoming eligible and can come online. And so, from our perspective, there's a lot of money on the table right now if communities and regional organizations are able to put their smart thinking caps on. And then I saw there's a question about green infrastructure, and both through ARPA and through the bipartisan infrastructure framework, the IIJA that was mentioned earlier, there are specific funding pots and emphasis on green infrastructure and ways that we can really make sure that our stormwater infrastructure best mimics nature's ability to absorb flood water and rainwater at the source, and so avoid it from going elsewhere.
Thank you, Zach. Roger, we've had a few folks talk about our NFIP standards, our freeboard. If you could explain a little bit more about what freeboard is and where that term comes from, and then also touch on the community rating system and how that's going to be up and beyond those the National Flood Insurance Program standards.
Sure. When we talk about freeboard, we're talking about a distance and elevation above that 100-year or that base flood elevation. So if everything we do is keyed toward what's the 100-year flood elevation at your location along your creek or the river in your backyard, it's different for as you go upstream, that 100-year elevation changes. So there's a unique 100-year elevation for your location, for your property, and to build to a freeboard above that for every 1 foot provides a higher level of protection. And so we talked earlier about the fact that some communities have freeboards of 1 to 2 feet. There's some communities in Middle Tennessee that have freeboards of 3 feet, and Nashville has a 4-foot freeboard for residential properties. We actually have a freeboard requirement for commercial properties as well. It's a 1-foot freeboard. So the measurement above the base flood, that's freeboard. And so I think that Tom Brashear had mentioned that the state model ordinance that's disseminated by the Tennessee Emergency Management Association that defines effective ways to establish your regulations in your community. And I think they're They're targeting, what was it, Tom, a 2-foot freeboard as kind of a minimum level for residential properties. But what you do is you're providing a higher level of protection by building your house a little bit higher. And in the case of the other floodplain requirements, the house in the floodplain would be required to have flood vents around the foundation, and that allows floodwater to flow into your foundation. And then as the water recedes, to flow back out of that foundation so that it doesn't cause structural damage to your foundation. Those are some of the requirements that are to be in good standing in the National Flood Insurance Program. You've got to be implementing and using those means of regulation.
Hey, Roger, I want to talk for a minute, and I want to put a shameless plug in here for a couple of things that have been helpful to me as a local floodplain administrator. One is being a member of Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers. Typically, the further you go out from an urban area, the more hats, in my perception, that the guy that gets dinged or the girl that gets dinged with being the floodplain manager wears. So for instance, just as Wilson County's floodplain manager, I am the Director of Development Services. So I'm over stormwater, I'm over building codes and zoning enforcement, I'm over planning. And in addition to that, I'm also the floodplain administrator for the county and for Watertown, the city of Watertown. And the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers helps me by having, at this point, monthly webinars to make sure that I'm staying up to speed on how to properly read an elevation certificate, which is one of the requirements if you build in or near a floodplain. It also helps me to stay in contact with and put a face with a name with, for instance, our FEMA Region 4 representative that's out of Atlanta, which covers our area. And the other thing that I wanted to put a plug in for, and Roger mentioned it a minute ago, was the community rating system. We are a member of the community rating system. I believe, based on previous discussions, we're one of about 12 communities. Metro Nashville is another one. Knoxville is another one that are members of the community rating system. What the community rating system requires is documentation of your program every year. And about every 3 or 4 years, they come in and they evaluate that, and you have an opportunity to be rated higher in that community rating system. But the benefit politically is all of your flood insurance policy holders, if you're involved in that program, get at least generally a 5% decrease in their flood insurance rates, and can get as much as 40 or 45%,
45.
depending on how high they go in the rating system. We are a level 9 and have worked very hard to try to get to a level 8 where we would get a 10% reduction. But what I like about it is because I do wear so many hats, it keeps me on my toes and makes sure that we keep our floodplain management program up to speed in terms of required documentation, make sure that we've got at least 1 or 2 people on staff that know how to properly read an elevation certificate, making sure that we are complying with the federal regulations or CFR requirements at a minimum. But as we've already discussed, the state model ordinance also gives us a little safeguard there too by throwing in an extra buffer of elevation requirement. So I just wanted to make one shameless plug for those 2 things that I think can help all of us better. And again, just understanding that local governments, particularly as you go further out into the rural fabric of Tennessee, you've got smaller staffs with more responsibilities, particularly as we start experiencing some of this growth we're experiencing in Middle Tennessee.
All right.
And we mentioned freeboard several times. Can you talk about the demonstrated benefits of that freeboard in Nashville?
Absolutely. So several years ago, former grad student of mine and I did a study for the city of Nashville looking at some of the benefits of the buyout program, which Roger mentioned earlier, as a mitigation strategy, removing people and their homes from harm's way in the floodplains after they've had substantial losses and repetitive flood events. That's part of the criteria for the buyouts. But another aspect of the study was to look at that 4-foot freeboard requirement, which was put in place, I believe, in 1979. So long time before some of the growth and development in Nashville, which was kind of unheard of at the time, but it was really an aggressive, proactive policy put in place. And from that study, we looked at, for the 2010 flood, if that freeboard requirement had not been in place, what the estimated damages would have been in the community. And that freeboard requirement alone saved approximately $2 billion in damages to homes and individuals' properties in the community. So there is a benefit. It's a policy. It does cost a little bit more to elevate a structure like a home when you're doing new construction in the flood zones, but to meet that freeboard requirement. But in the long term, the amount of damages that can be reduced are immeasurable, probably. I also wanted to mention, because Tom mentioned ASF, the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers. I'm also a member and a certified floodplain manager, which has been highly educational and useful for our work. So I'm going to plug that Roger and his counterpart over at Metro Water, Tom Palco, do an excellent job reviewing individuals for the CFM exam, which is typically offered with the state conference as part of the state conference. And it was very educational to go through the process to become a CFM and better understand what's involved there. Another thing Tom mentioned about the CRS, the community rating system, and it's really disappointing that only a handful of communities are part of that. And as we think about our region and the state as a whole, the benefits of participating in that are, well touted by Tom and Roger when they talk about the flood insurance reductions for homeowners, and the documentation does help you understand more what's going on and what you can do to help mitigate flooding. But I see that we have challenges with socioeconomic differences across the state, where many communities just don't have the staff or the capacity to do the work to be part of the CRS. And it's, from my perspective and what I've learned about the process, we have great people through the Tennessee Association of State Floodplain Managers that would be willing to mentor communities and getting their documentation together. I know Roger and Tom Palco have both talked about mentoring and conversations like with the Tennessee Silver Jackets consortium. But I think we also need to think about how we can further help communities to become part of the CRS, and they're wearing so many hats like Tom mentioned.
Thank you, Janey. We did have a question about details about the flood portal. Patrick, can you provide some more information there?
Yeah, so there's a grant that the state got recently, and as part of that grant, they're developing what's right now, it's called the TN Plan portal, and it's going to be added within that portal. And what one of the capabilities, portal is going to have many capabilities. Janey's also working on another piece there. And one of the capabilities I mentioned earlier was being able to do basically a local flood risk assessment just by clicking, and it would develop with just some minimal user inputs, like, are you looking for a 100-year event, a 500-year event? What are you looking at? It would show you a visualization of what the floodplain would look like. And so what that's all based off of, LiDAR data and lots of complex scientific algorithms that I'm not going to go into here. But that's going to be rolled out over the next year. And so you'll be seeing more presentations like that. I do want to, to continue to kind of toot the horn of the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers. One of the biggest things about being involved in that is that it gives you a network of people to just pick up the phone and call. And so I'm going to go ahead and volunteer Roger, Tom, and Janey, and people that you can call that are very in tune with that program. You can call me too if you want. But what they'll do is, like, you can just ask questions, and they may or may not know the answer. And if they don't know the answer, though, they probably know somebody within the state that does. And I'll also mention, you've heard mentioned on this call, our state NFIP coordinator, Amy Miller. She's probably more passionate about this topic than we are. And you can call Amy and ask her questions as well. You know, she is, if you've got a question about your local flood ordinance, she is the expert in the state to call. She will know the answer. So, you know, we've got these resources that I just want to, you know, continue to tell you guys to reach out to. And also the states, the annual conference is in Knoxville this year, and it's in early August. So if you guys, if anybody on the call has a chance, that'd be something, a great opportunity for you to just go. And yes, there's going to be educational presentations, but more so to just go and meet people from other communities around the state that you can talk to and learn things. Because there's great, so, you know, we have a bunch of people from Middle Tennessee on this call, because that's, you know, it's about the Cumberland region, but we also have great folks from East Tennessee and West Tennessee that have expertise about this. So if you're, you know, if you're kind of getting on the edges of the region, or you're from those other regions, you can meet some people and connect, and then have a greater, you know, just network of people to call when something comes up in your community.
Thanks, Patrick. I appreciate that plug for TNAFPM. Another program that we wanted to introduce you to as well is Flood Ready Tennessee. Zach, can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah, so in my role, looking across the country at ways that we can help elevate, you know, good and smart policy and opportunities for states to advance resilience. We've been working pretty closely with Flood Ready Tennessee, which is a coalition of elected officials, homeowners, small business owners, faith leaders, community members across the state who are really dedicated to, you know, making Tennessee more resilient to the financial impact of frequent flooding. And so I think just put some numbers on it. Flooding is the most, I think, widespread, destructive, and costliest natural disaster in Tennessee. It averages about $243 million each year. And that's, you know, kind of outside of these major, you know, flood events like Waverly and 2010 floods. And so what Flood Ready Tennessee is doing is really calling on the legislature to put forward a proactive approach to build a statewide resilience plan and strategy that, you know, incorporates all of the various resilient pieces across state agencies and departments, whether that's through TDOT or TDEC or ECD or TEMA. You have all of these agencies within the state that have their various pieces of resilience. And what we found that's been really successful in other states are when these agencies come together, they figure out, you know, where the most, what areas are in most need, and how can they really develop programs and projects and funding to address resilience in the state. And so Flood Ready Tennessee, in addition to the Association of Floodplain Managers, you know, if your community is interested in thinking about resilience from a statewide perspective, I'd plug floodreadytn.com, and, you know, we'd be happy to, you know, connect with you and hear your stories and really think about, you know, what are ways that as a state, you know, we can make sure that flooding is a top of mind priority for state government, and we can really start to make a difference and see change. Because as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of nationally at a time right now where there's more investments in resilience than there've ever been in decades, if not longer. And so communities and regional groups and individuals that are willing to, you know, put in the effort and think through, you know, what resilience looks like are going to be able to access those dollars.
Thank you, Zach. I think, Tom, you wanted to talk a little bit more about the need for funding, particularly for your local government there?
Yes. As someone mentioned earlier, there's quite a bit of money through the, I think it's the American Rescue and Recovery Act and other sources right now. Is sort of one-time money that can help us with specific flooding issues, buyout programs that Roger's talked about, and other things. But one thing as a county planner and as a county floodplain administrator that I've noticed is that we have some structural issues that are working against us, whether it be due to smaller communities having lack of staff, or whether it be truly due to state legislated structure of government. And what I mean by that is in many cases, the only public works entity that county governments have would be one of two bodies. It would either be the road commission or the highway department, or the solid waste authority. And in both cases, those entities are specifically precluded in many instances from being able to work on private property whatsoever. Now, where that becomes an issue is when you're in a suburban area or when you're in an area that's grown in spurts over time. Maybe you've got development that started in the 50s and you had a boom in the late 60s, early 70s, and it slowed off. And then you got some additional subdivisions in the 80s. After several decades, the drainage systems that were initially installed, if they were installed with any standard whatsoever, even if they were installed to a good standard at that time, due to just natural sedimentation, growth, and other things, the drainage ways may migrate a bit and cause obstructions. Stream cleanups aside, there's not a whole lot that county governments can do on private property, nor do most of them have any type of public works department similar to what many of your municipalities do have, particularly your larger ones like Metro Nashville. And so there's, even if we wanted to, for instance, I don't have a bulldozer. If I wanted to come out and dig out a ditch for somebody and clean it out and reestablish a detention area or something, I can't do that on private property once the initial development is developed. So I think it's kind of incumbent upon us as a state and as a group of thinkers on this issue to come up with some way that revenue and legislative authority can be put aside to establish some ongoing additional public works entities to assist with maybe aging drainage areas.
Roger, I have a question, and you may be able to help with this with your experience at Metro Nashville. Just talking about development outside of the floodplain and how we have regulations for development there that may, be related to flooding outside of the mapped floodplain area. Anything like you want to talk about with like updates to the stormwater manual, anything along those lines?
Sure. One of the key components to the new FEMA insurance rating program, FEMA for the first time in probably 40 years has this past year changed the way they rate structures for flood insurance. It goes toward how your insurance agent, how he calculates your flood insurance premiums. And the one very significant change is that there's less reliance on mapped floodplains and more on the actual risk of your structure. So the new FEMA flood insurance rating system is called Risk Rating 2.0. Keys more on the distance your house is from the flooding source. How far is your house from the creek or the river, and how opulent perhaps is your house? What's the cost to replace that house? So it's a whole lot less than it's more complex than the old system of saying, well, you're in the floodplain, you're in the mapped floodplain based on the FEMA flood maps, and so you've got your mortgage company is going to contact you and say you've got to have flood insurance. Now the mortgage company would be in the same scenario, would be saying it doesn't matter that you're not in the floodplain, you're sufficiently close to the flooding source and your house is sufficiently expensive that in order to protect their investment, they're going to require you to carry flood insurance. So the question then is that significantly more in terms of increased cost of flood insurance premiums? What FEMA is trying to do is to more accurately represent the risk of flooding. And so these components are so interrelated. When we talk about the CRS program a few minutes ago, if you're facing much higher flood insurance premiums because of the higher risk to your home, then it's more important than ever that your community be in the community rating system and has a good rating. The city of Knoxville has the highest rating in the state right now with a level 6. Level 10 is kind of the starting point. All the way up to level 1 is the highest, and there's only 2 communities in the entire United States that are level 1s. But the better you get with your rating, if your community is doing more outreach, more education to the residents about flooding, the potential for flooding, flood sources, flood mitigation, those kinds of things all go toward a better CRS rating, which allows then the rate payers, those who are purchasing flood insurance for their homes, to be able to take advantage of discounts to those what otherwise higher and higher flood insurance premiums.
Thank you, Roger. I know it was great for you to touch on that new risk rating 2.0. That's a huge game change when it comes to flood insurance. We do have a question here, and I'm not sure, Janey, if you can take this one or not. It's talking about estimating the impact of, or the impact on flooding when we, lose our pervious surface and we have that increase in rain intensity. I don't know if you've done any studies like that at the university.
So we've not done specific studies on that. And it's really kind of the combination of both things coming together is what we're seeing, contributing to the flooding, especially in urban areas right now, where we're seeing the development more impervious area. I guess I will say, we have not parsed that out yet, but there's potential to get to that, hopefully coming down the pipeline. We are currently partnering with TSU on a grant proposal to do urban kind of field laboratory focused on flooding in the Nashville area, where we will hopefully be deploying more gauges, getting a better understanding of the precipitation. And a lot of people don't understand, when you have a storm event, there are areas where you have more precipitation, even in an area as small as Nashville. Some areas may get a few inches more than another area, depending on where the storm sits and how it moves across the region. So we're hoping to deploy more gauges, get a better understanding of kind of the localized terrain. A lot of the flood modeling uses kind of a watershed approach. And in the urban area, you have an unconventional watershed, based on engineering training. You've got this watershed and everything runs downhill, and you have the terrain to take into account. But in an urban area, you have mixed terrains that it's hard to assign generic or average numbers to for what the surface is, and the amount of imperviousness and the roughness and those things. So hopefully, if we're successful in getting this project, we'll have a better answer, especially for the Nashville community on that. But it is kind of both things coming together in the perfect storm that lead to flooding. And I know we've already alluded, and Tom and Roger may want to speak to this, the role of development. We see development happening. Nashville's got a low impact development regulation in place and programs for that to help capture some of that initial runoff, especially on commercialized development, so that it's not contributing to localized flooding as more impervious area is added through development. But there is the challenge of localized flooding, and Roger was involved in a Smart Cities Council series of webinars where we discussed some of the issues in Nashville. Jennifer Higgs with Metro IT did some great mapping analysis. And those webinars are recorded, publicly available. And it was interesting to see how some flood mitigation improvements in the stormwater system and drainage infrastructure have led to less localized flooding in areas that are developing quickly. But also looking at one thing we looked at was the trend of, some of the remodeling and tearing down ranch homes on lot and putting up too tall skinnies, how that may be contributing to some localized flooding in areas that have flooded before. And so those are things that, everyone, Roger and Tom and the planning department have to take into account as people are rebuilding and flipping houses and those things. We can't control all of it, and it is definitely a factor in addition to the intense storm events we're seeing. That was a long-winded answer, sorry.
And I want to just kind of, we talked earlier about green infrastructure and what we can do to make the soil more pervious. And indeed, Metro does have a low impact component to our stormwater management. And it's a good thing to do because we want to protect our buffers along our creeks and rivers. We want those buffers to infiltrate rainwater into the natural soil. But even a well-constructed, a well-designed green infrastructure project will not offset the impacts of a severe rain event. And to those that after the 2010 event said, well, that's a 100-year storm, we'll never see another one like that in our lifetime. The reality is, and I could go on for an hour on extreme rain events and atmospheric rivers and things like that. We're experiencing these freak events. After the 2010 flood here in Nashville, we had extreme events over smaller basins. In August of 2013, there was a severe event in Murray County in 2015. Hurricane Harvey, after it caused its devastation over Texas and Louisiana, came up and squatted on top of North Nashville for 3 days. And we had significant rain from what we've come to refer to as the remnants of Harvey storm. In February of 2019, we had, I think that was the year we had the all-time record wettest February on record. In September of 2020, we had a 6 to 8 inch event farther downstream, the Mill Creek Basin, Hurricane Creek, over closer to Percy Priest Reservoir. In March of 2021, we had another atmospheric river that caused significant flooding in Nashville. And that's the one we're still recovering from here. 7 Mile Creek and Mill Creek here in Nashville had upwards of 200 houses flood. And so people say, well, they look at 2010 as the standard by which we define extreme weather. And if I didn't flood in 2010, then I'm safe forever. Well, one of these unusual little freak events over a smaller drainage basin can cause 100 houses to flood. That's a storm over that basin that's more severe than what they experienced in 2010. So these events, we're seeing more and more of these 8 to 10 inch events, almost one a year. And then there was September of 2021, last fall, Waverly, a 17 inch rain event that was not. I consulted with some of my buddies down at the Army Corps of Engineers Research Center down in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they confirmed for me that storm over Waverly was not an atmospheric river, which we would otherwise characterize as causing these extreme events. So it just goes toward reinforcing the fact that we need to always be prepared for the next event, which could be in the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year away. These things are not happening once in a lifetime. They're happening on a regular basis. And it, it makes it more important than ever for a community to have a good set of stormwater and floodplain requirements, and to enforce those requirements, because we call them subsequent victims here in Nashville. It's a new person that moves to town and buys a house that has a lovely backyard that backs up to a creek. And it turns out it's a house that's subject to flooding, and that's just disastrous for a young family.
Thank you, Roger. Previously, Tom, you had mentioned that a lot of our communities are lacking in resources and staff. And Zach, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about how other states are addressing, that gap in funding and that gap in resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple trends here. One is that there's actually more and more states that are starting to require and ask that local communities take resilience and future risk into account. Neighbor to Tennessee, South Carolina, they passed a law that requires resilience elements to be included in their local comprehensive plans. Similarly, there's new policies coming out in New Jersey and Washington State. And so states with really different both geographic features, but also different politics, where local governments and planning organizations are being asked to do more with resilience and thinking forward. So to the second part is how are local communities supposed to do this with limited funding and budgets? And again, I think we could look to, your neighbors in South Carolina, where they've created an Office of Resilience, which is tasked with, one, identifying future programs to fund, and also put together a strategic statewide plan, while also providing technical assistance to these local communities to incorporate resilience into their comprehensive plans. Similarly, North Carolina is looking at ways that they can provide technical assistance from the state level down to local governments. And then from a ground up approach, there's also numerous instances where groups of local governments and regional districts have banded together to share resources and to think through how they can jointly fund a certified floodplain manager, how they can jointly look at flood risks up and down a watershed. So there's a lot of different approaches out there. And I think one thing that we're seeing is that the more that the communities are engaged, and like Roger just mentioned, the more that we can think about flood risk and resilience, the better prepared the communities will be in the future.
That was great, Zach. There's some other examples within the SEC of states that that have also taken this approach of creating these programs. The state of Louisiana has received a HUD grant where they're going to study the entire state. So new flood studies for the entire state, with the goal of those resulting in mitigation projects. There was a question earlier about future planning future conditions being rolled into mitigation projects. That's definitely something that should be looked at, because you need to understand that, between the time you've got a plan for a mitigation project and the time that it's actually built, it could be 5, 10 years, maybe even more. So, anticipating what the development within that watershed is going to be within that time, and building that into the construction project, so that once you've built something, it does truly provide protection. Another example, in the state of Texas, Texas has, as a state, committed just state dollars. They have set aside, sliced off a budget of many millions of dollars to study the entire state of Texas again, and look at quantifying that risk and develop regional groups within the state to identify local officials on regional teams, identifying projects that are going to be regionally effective. And then using the studies that the state is paying for as a starting point to then build these mitigation projects that we have local regional teams developing. And so we've got, this is happening all across the Southeast and within the SEC. And so, we as Tennessee need to kind of just start looking around at our neighbors and saying, what can we do? One thing that the state could do to ease the burden is the state of Tennessee is technically a cooperating technical partner with FEMA. However, it is the least active within all of the Region 4 states, meaning that currently it's housed within the state's IT department. So you can imagine that the IT department is not really doing flood studies or flood mitigation projects. So, maybe if we move that to a different group within the state, and then start pursuing those grant dollars, where the other states, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, they're getting millions of dollars every year in grant money from FEMA to do new flood studies in their states. This is, resulting in more resilient communities there. We don't have that in Tennessee. We're relying on FEMA to have the state's best interests at heart. Well, that's not necessarily what they're paid to do. So we need to, kind of think about taking a little bit more ownership at the state level, and also recognizing that from a financial perspective, it's a financial benefit to the state. All of a sudden, we've got millions and millions in grant dollars running through the state's books, and paying for people's jobs within the state, and paying for people like me, to do this work within Tennessee, whereas the majority of flood studies that I do are elsewhere in the country. And it's for reasons like this, where it's like, well, we've got other states that are running these programs that I'm working for, but I'm not doing it in Tennessee because we don't have a robust program. So kind of, urging people, and we're moving in that direction. I don't want to be like, a negative Nelly on this forum. We are moving forward as a state, and you can see there's a lot of momentum. We just need to keep that going, and we hope that through this forum, we are gaining just more of the community to push forward.
Cindy, if I might follow up on Patrick's suggestion, yes, we do need an improved CTP program for the state of Tennessee. We've looked at that, but Another thing Patrick mentioned was about, kind of building for the future and think about the future. And I'm going to also kind of tag Roger on this because we've had multiple conversations. One way to leverage funding, and we don't want to do this in the aftermath of an event. We don't want a disaster, but hazard mitigation plans. I know there's been some conversation and interest in comps plans, but another thing that communities have to work on are developing their hazard mitigation plans. They're required, and I know a lot of communities are farming those out to engineering firms, and it's very much, unfortunately, from what I've seen, filling in the blanks, checking the boxes, meeting the minimal requirements, as opposed to really thinking about the future. And I know Roger and Tom Palco, I've heard multiple conversations from them about how they, like Nashville's hazard mitigation plan is very proactive, and other communities could take a similar approach and build in flood mitigation projects into those hazard mitigation plans that could help them in the instance that you do have a significant flooding event that would open up mitigation funding or recovery funds that could be leveraged to improve the situation in the absence of like ARPA and JA funding and those things. We don't want to do things kind of on the back end of an event or a disaster, but to the extent we can build stuff in on the front end in those hazard mitigation plans that open up funding to make a difference for the future, I think we should be doing that also.
And just to follow up on a point that Jamie made is that a community needs to be prepared. We have in Metro, we've been buying and demolishing houses for a good number of years, probably going back some 15 years or so. These are typically houses that are subject to severe repetitive flooding. FEMA has a characterization of a house as being a severe repetitive loss, SRL or repetitive loss. And there's FEMA funding to remove those repetitive loss properties. And again, we have records of structures that have flooded anywhere from 2 or 3 times to a half dozen times to a dozen times. And FEMA will fund the removal of a repetitive loss property to the tune of 90%. And if it's a severe repetitive loss property with upwards of 4 losses, they will fund 100% of the cost of taking out a severe repetitive loss property. Now, I know some communities, maybe smaller communities, say, well, we can't afford that hit on our tax base. But I submit that if you've got a family living in a house that's flooded multiple times, they can't afford the hit on their sanity. I mean, at some point, a house that's subject to that level of flood damage needs to go away. And there are a couple of mechanisms. Jamie talked about the grant programs that are available. In 2010, there was a presidential disaster declaration, which made 44 counties in the state of Tennessee all part of that disaster declaration. They were all subject to eligibility for hazard mitigation grant funds, HMGP funds. And there are other cases where, and there routinely are disaster declarations in the state of Tennessee. They can be for weather-related disasters. They can be for winter ice storms. They can be for forest fires in Sevier County. All of those are cases where there have been disaster declarations. And if a local community is not in good standing and doesn't have an up-to-date mitigation plan, then their eligibility to receive those grant funds is greatly compromised. I think that in the aftermath of the Waverly event, that a community sometimes can get some of those disaster funds, but they get it on kind of a probationary basis. So, and I'm not an expert in those grant programs, but the state of Tennessee, TEMA, Doug Warden, they can provide a lot of good guidance and information on how to optimize your your use of available grant funds, but you need to be prepared. You need to be ready. You need to know how to put together a grants package, and you can capitalize on monies that might have happened in a disaster in a different part of the state. And we've done that before in Nashville. If the money's not being used at that other location, then that money is sitting at TEMA waiting for somebody that can prepare a good, complete application, and a community needs to be ready to do that. We've offered through the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers, to give yet another shameless plug for Tennessee AFPM. There are a good number of communities in Tennessee that can do this, and we would love to function in a mentor kind of a relationship with a smaller community, to help through the process of getting these grant packages together, and so that communities that have great needs can take advantage of the money that would be available.
Thank you, Roger. And part of that eligibility is having that local hazard mitigation plan. Zach, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about stats for hazard mitigation plans in the state.
Yeah, and just thinking about how you might kind of cross where the risk is highest in the state, and what communities have the tools that are really looking about how to mitigate that risk. First Street Foundation came out with a report that looked at flood risk to properties across the country, and they can go down into the state level data. And the 15 counties in the state that have the highest percentage of properties at risk, according to this data, 3 of those counties don't have a hazard mitigation plan, and 10 of those counties are considered economically at risk or distressed by the state. So yeah, there really is a strong need and cross section of risk and vulnerability that's present in the state that simple. I don't want to say simple, but the initial steps of planning for hazards and resilience really can start to address.
Cindy, I kind of started us down a path of negativity, and I apologize for that. And I want to kind of bring it full circle. There are some things that we in local government, I think, are doing better than perhaps we did 15 or 20 years ago. One example is, I think that we all, while we may still have some structural issues, as I mentioned, on maintenance and upkeep of drainage facilities that exist, on new development, I feel like many of the communities in Middle Tennessee are stepping up and trying to at least establish standards, if not improve standards over time, as they see the need to do so. I know when I first got into planning, not every community in Middle Tennessee even had standard drainage review as a part of their subdivision development. And I'm going to kind of roll into a couple of the questions we got from the audience about the engagement between planning departments and stormwater programs and floodplain management. I think it's imperative that whoever your floodplain manager is, they need to be involved in the planning process so that they can get some of that, at least the Federal Register requirements, if not the heightened requirements that we've talked about already today, kind of baked into the design review process for subdivision or commercial development in Middle Tennessee. Just as an example, I don't know that we necessarily had an established standard when I got here in 2001. We now review for storm events and require designs for storm events to adequately contain the 2 through 25 year storm events statistically by the designs that we receive from different developers and their engineers. There's been some discussion, is that high enough? I know as recently as 5 to 10, maybe 15 years ago, the standard was actually a 10-year storm that you would design for. So we're actually heightening our standards to the 2 to 25 year storm event, with the ability to safely pass a 100-year storm event, even if you're not containing it all on site. So there are some things we're doing positively. I just wanted to point out that there are some structural obstacles in our way that are kind of juxtaposed to long-standing structure in things like county government for highway departments and solid waste authorities that may have upwards of 50, 60, 70 years of tenure. We don't really have as huge a track record of at least county governments and smaller local communities taking up the public works initiatives for ongoing drainage maintenance, for existing drainage that's after the development's already occurred and long since been there.
Thank you, Tom. Zach, we just had a quick question about the data that you talked about, where they can access that data.
Yep, that's from the First Street Foundation, and their website is firststreet.org. And they've looked at both individual property risk across the country, in addition to infrastructure. So you can drill down into state level views, and actually they have a flood factor tool, which you can pull up your own property and see what their data says about your own property. It's firststreet.org.
Thank you, Zach. So we're nearing the very end of our presentation and forum. Do either of our panelists have any last minute thoughts that they'd like to add? Any ending messages or thoughts?
I do want to respond to one question we got from the audience about the comp planning process that many planning departments take on. Right now, we're in the middle of a land use plan update. We did a comp plan update in 2017, I believe, and a growth plan update in 2013. Yes, the answer is yes. There is the need for consideration of drainage and stormwater issues in any plan update that your planning office undertakes. And in fact, in our public initial public input hearings that we held just recently, it was loud and clear a topic, given all of the additional growth that we're getting in Middle Tennessee, and particularly in my case in Wilson County. It was certainly something people wanted to talk about, were drainage issues and flooding and the propensity or the fear that there was going to be heightened levels of that going forward. So I think it's incumbent upon us, as not only as floodplain administrators, but as planners and civil engineers, to take that into consideration when we're updating plans.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. So we started the forum with Roger mentioning, 4 main topics, and I think that we've doubled or tripled, all of those topics that we've talked about today, from, identifying our flooding areas, whether that's the special flood hazard area or outside of that, educating our floodplain administrators so they can do their jobs better and they're better prepared in that role. We've talked about planning, mitigation planning, comprehensive planning, and the needs not only to prepare those plans to be eligible for funding, but also implementation of those plans, and especially flood insurance and the need for our residents to know it's available, to know that's available inside and outside of the floodplain wherever they're located. And again, with that, educating our public on their flood hazard, their flood risk, and what they can do even as individuals, whether that's outside of what we're doing as a community. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their extensive experience and knowledge. Appreciate that. And thank you to our attendees and all of your questions that helped kind of generate a great discussion, which we could keep going on for hours, but I know we're here at the end. And the Cumberland Region Tomorrow, I hope I said that correctly. I'm so sorry, Shelley. They want to thank you for attending. We'll be hosting more forums in the future. And the next one to keep an eye out for is on October the 18th. That's the next Power of 10 Summit. So thanks again for everyone's participation, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending the Power of 10. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Have a great day.